Real property versus personal property. In the previous section, you learned how fixtures, trade fixtures, and implements create a bridge between real and personal property. Now we will tie those principles together by comparing the two categories directly and exploring how property ownership is regulated at the federal, state, and local levels. Real property includes land, improvements attached to it, and the rights associated with ownership. This encompasses the surface of the land, everything beneath it, everything attached to it, and the air above it. Fixtures, attachments, and conversions by affixing, such as installing a built-in oven, a swimming pool, or a permanent lighting system, are all examples of real property because they are intended to stay with the land. Personal property, on the other hand, refers to movable items that are not permanently attached to real estate. Trade fixtures, implements, and conversions by severance, such as removing a freestanding refrigerator, harvesting crops, or taking down portable fencing, represent personal property. The key distinction is mobility and intention. If the item can be moved without damaging the property and was never intended to remain permanently, it is considered personal property. Property interests and government regulation. Although the U.S. Constitution guarantees private ownership of property, that ownership is not absolute. Real property is heavily regulated by federal, state, and local governments, each controlling specific aspects of property use, ownership, and transfer. These layers of regulation ensure that property rights are exercised responsibly and in the public interest. Areas of regulation. Government entities regulate several areas of real estate ownership and practice, including the bundle of rights, possession, usage, transfer, encumbrance, and exclusion, legal descriptions and property boundaries, financing and insurance, inheritance, and taxation. These regulations come from a mix of federal and state laws, local ordinances, and judicial decisions. Federal regulation. At the federal level, the government establishes broad standards to promote fair housing, environmental protection, and consumer safety. Agencies like the Federal Housing Administration, FHA, support home ownership through mortgage programs, while the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, enforces environmental safety standards and regulates hazardous materials. The Federal Fair Housing Act of 1968 prohibits housing discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, and the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, establishes accessibility standards. The federal government, however, does not levy real estate taxes. State regulation. State governments are the primary regulators of the real estate industry. They create and enforce real estate license laws, establish commissions such as the Arizona Department of Real Estate, ADRE, and determine who may practice as a real estate professional. States also regulate property ownership, transfer, taxation, and environmental standards. For example, Arizona regulates flood zones, waste disposal, and groundwater usage under the Arizona Department of Environmental Quality, ADEQ. States may levy property taxes directly or delegate that power to local governments. Local regulation county and municipal governments control land use, zoning, building permits, and local taxation. Zoning laws dictate how land can be developed: residential, commercial, industrial, or agricultural, and building codes regulate construction safety. Local governments also have the authority to impose property taxes, which fund schools, infrastructure, and emergency services. Judicial regulation. The courts play an important role in interpreting and enforcing real estate laws. Judicial regulation comes from two sources: case law and common law. Case law is based on past judicial decisions that set precedents for future rulings. Common law is derived from long-standing customs and social practices that have become accepted legal principles. For instance, the case Murray v. Zerbel, 1988 in Arizona, clarified the three-part test for determining whether personal property has become a fixture: annexation, adaptation, and intention. farming and crops, the example of emblements. In agricultural real estate, property can shift between real and personal categories depending on its stage of production. Crops growing in the ground are considered real property because they are attached to the land. Once harvested, they become personal property because they can be moved and sold with a bill of sale rather than a deed. Emblements are annual crops grown through human labor, such as corn, wheat, or vegetables, and are considered the tenant's personal property even if the land changes ownership. Under the doctrine of emblements, a tenant who planted crops before losing possession of the land retains the right to re-enter and harvest those crops. This principle protects tenant farmers from losing the fruits of their labor due to circumstances beyond their control, such as the sale or foreclosure of the property. For example, if Farmer Jones leases land from owner Smith and plants corn in March, but Smith sells the land to buyer Taylor in June, Farmer Jones still has the right to harvest the corn in the fall. The crops remain his personal property under the doctrine of emblements. Bill of sale. When personal property is sold, ownership is transferred through a bill of sale rather than a deed. A bill of sale documents the transfer and includes key details such as the date of sale, the parties involved, the items sold, and the purchase price. In Arizona, a bill of sale is used to transfer ownership of personal items such as mobile homes not affixed to land, furniture, or farm equipment. For example, when a mobile home located on leased land is sold, the buyer and seller execute a bill of sale that lists the home's make, model, and serial number. The buyer then takes the bill of sale to the Arizona Department of Transportation to register ownership because the transaction involves personal, not real, property. Practical examples in Arizona: real estate tenants fencing. If portable fencing belongs to a tenant, it does not convey with the property when sold, even if present during showings. Refrigerators. Unless written into the purchase contract, a freestanding refrigerator does not convey with the property. Storage sheds. Even if a shed is not attached to the ground, the Arizona Association of Realtors, AAR Residential Resale Contract, specifies that outdoor structures generally transfer with the property unless excluded in writing. Review summary. In this section, you learned that real property includes land, improvements, and fixtures, while personal property consists of movable objects, such as furniture or trade fixtures. Governments at all levels, federal, state, local, and judicial, regulate ownership, taxation, and land use to maintain fair practices and public welfare. The doctrine of emblements protects tenant farmers' rights to harvest crops they have planted, and bills of sale are used to transfer ownership of personal property. Discussion. Why is it important for real estate agents to distinguish between real and personal property in a sale? Answer: because it determines what conveys to the buyer. Items not listed as fixtures or written into the contract as included personal property remain the seller's property. How does the doctrine of emblements protect tenant farmers? Answer: it allows them to harvest crops they planted before losing possession of the land, preserving their investment of labor and resources. Why do federal, state, and local governments regulate real property ownership? Answer: to ensure that property rights are exercised responsibly, protect the public, and maintain fair housing, environmental standards, and orderly land development. Why is a bill of sale necessary for personal property transactions? Answer: it provides legal documentation that ownership has been transferred, protecting both the buyer and seller in case of dispute. Closing remarks. Understanding the difference between real and personal property and how each is regulated is essential for every real estate professional. Whether handling residential, agricultural, or commercial transactions, knowing which items convey, which remain personal, and how the law defines each protects your clients and ensures smooth closings. As you continue your studies, remember that every transaction is rooted in this fundamental distinction.